In an army of thousands, only 500 men truly mattered. These weren't just soldiers. They were the armored fist of Christendom, the mounted heavy knights whose singular purpose was to deliver a kinetic shock so devastating that it could shatter empires. While the history books speak of massive armies and religious fervor, the reality of survival often came down to a specific terrifying calculus of steel and momentum. Mathematics said they should die. Mythology said they would become legends. Facing them was a force of 40,000 Seljuk Turks, masters of the steppe, lethal archers who had turned the plains of Anatolia into a graveyard for the unwary. But on one sweltering morning in July, the established rules of warfare were suspended. A tiny vanguard of ironclad warriors launched a charge that didn't just break a line. It broke the psychological spine of the East. Picture this scene. It is July 1st, 1097. The location is the valley of Dorylaeum, a dusty, scorched expanse in the heart of modern-day Turkey. The heat is oppressive, a physical weight that presses down on the chest, making the air shimmer with mirages. For the Crusaders marching through this alien landscape, the environment itself is an enemy. Their armor, designed for the cooler climates of France and Italy, has become a torture device, cooking them alive in their own sweat. But the heat is the least of their worries. The silence of the valley is about to be torn apart by a sound that resembles the buzzing of a billion angry wasps. This is not the disorganized rabble the Turks expected, nor is it the invincible legion the Crusaders hoped to be. It is a collision of two worlds, two technologies of war, and two definitions of courage. And it begins with a mistake that nearly doomed the First Crusade before it truly began. To understand the sheer impossibility of what happened next, you have to look at the map. The Crusader army, a massive, unwieldy beast of soldiers, priests, and camp followers, had made a fatal error. They had split into two columns. The vanguard, led by the Norman giant Bohund of Taranto, was marching days ahead of the main force. They believed the roads were safe. They believed the enemy was scattered. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the silence of the Anatolian plateau. It is often a deception. Watching from the ridges was Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of Rome. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a tactician who had already annihilated a previous wave of crusaders known as the People's Crusade. He looked down at Bohemond's isolated force not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a wolf watching a lost sheep. He had assembled a massive coalition of 40,000 horse archers, and he had chosen the perfect kill zone. As the sun began to crest the jagged hills, the trap was sprung. It didn't start with a roar, but with a sudden darkening of the sky. Thousands of arrows, fired in high arcs, descended like black rain upon the Crusader camp. The sound of arrows striking chainmail, wood, and flesh was a chaotic drumming that signaled the beginning of the end. Panic, sharp and electric, surged through the camp. Men scrambled for their shields, horses screamed in terror, and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood. Bohemond, a veteran of wars against the Byzantine Empire, instantly realized the magnitude of his error. He was outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from help. A lesser commander would have ordered a retreat, which would have turned into a slaughter. Instead, Bohemond did something that defied the instincts of self-preservation. He ordered his knights to dismount. He ordered the infantry to form a defensive perimeter protecting the civilians and the baggage. He created a fortress of flesh and iron in the middle of the open plain. The Turkish tactics were designed to madden as much as to kill. They would ride in close, loose a volley of arrows, and wheel away before the heavy Crusader knights could retaliate. It was a torment of frustration. The Crusaders were like a bear being stung to death by a swarm of bees. For hours they stood their ground. The temperature rose to nearly 90 degrees. Thirst began to set in, a torment as sharp as the Turkish arrows. But here is where the psychological depth of the battle reveals itself. Inside that circle of death, the women of the camp became the unsung heroes of the day. While arrows rained down, they ran back and forth from the dwindling water supplies to the front lines, offering drinks to the gasping soldiers and whispering prayers of encouragement. It was a surreal juxtaposition of domestic tenderness and industrial-scale violence. Their courage shored up the crumbling morale of the men, buying Bowen and time. Yet, time was exactly what they were running out of. By midday, the Crusader line was buckling. The Turks, sensing blood, began to press closer, their taunts ringing out over the clash of steel. They were moving in for the kill, confident that the heavy European knights were too exhausted, too slow, and too few to stop the inevitable massacre. Kilij Arslan watched from the heights, convinced that he was about to extinguish the crusade in a single morning. This is the moment where history usually turns tragic. The surrounded force, exhausted and bleeding, prepares for the final stand. The enemy tightens the noose. The commanders look to the heavens and see only indifference. But Dorylaeum was not destined to be a tragedy. It was destined to be a miracle. Unbeknownst to the Sultan, messengers had broken out of the encirclement hours earlier. They had ridden their horses to death, galloping back along the dusty road to find the second column of the Crusader army, and they found them. The second force was led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois. When they heard the news, there was no council of war, no debate. They sounded the trumpets. What happened next was a feat of mobilization that rivals any in military history. The Second Army didn't just march. They sprinted. Knights rode ahead of their infantry, pushing their mounts to the breaking point. They navigated the treacherous terrain, fueled by the desperate knowledge that their brothers were being slaughtered just over the horizon. Back in the valley, the situation had gone from desperate to critical. The Turks had breached the perimeter in several places. Hand-to-hand combat had broken out near the baggage train. Bohemund was fighting with the desperation of a man who knows he is seeing his last sunset. The Turkish victory cry was rising, a deafening roar that drowned out the screams of the dying. On the ridgeline behind the Turkish army, a glint of steel appeared. Then another. Then 1,000. The Crusaders of the second column had arrived, but they didn't just arrive. They arrived in perfect formation for a catastrophe. To the Turks who had been so focused on the prey in front of them, the sudden appearance of a fresh army on their flank was a cognitive shock they couldn't process. But the true turning point, the moment that would haunt Turkish nightmares for generations, came from the mountains to the rear. A third force, led by the papal legate Ademar, had performed a flanking maneuver through impossible terrain. They appeared behind the Turkish lines, threatening to encircle the encirclement. The stage was set for the charge. The elite heavy cavalry, the 500 knights who formed the tip of Godfrey's spear, lowered their lances. You must understand the physics of a knightly charge to appreciate this moment. A war horse and rider, clad in mail, weighs over 1,500 pounds. Multiply that by 500, moving at 25 miles per hour. It is a kinetic force equal to a locomotive. The order was given. God wills it. Roared from hundreds of throats. The ground shook. This is not a poetic exaggeration. The chronicles insist the earth trembled. The Crusader knights didn't trot. They thundered. They accelerated into a wedge formation, a solid arrow of steel aimed directly at the confused and disorganized Turkish flank. For the Turkish light cavalry, speed was their armor. But speed requires space, and in the confusion of the surprise, they had none. They were packed tight, focused on Bohemund. When the Crusader charge hit them, it didn't just kill, it pulverized. The impact was sickeningly loud. Lances shattered shields, horses smashed into horses, and the disciplined Turkish lines evaporated in an instant. It was a collision of military philosophies. The Turks relied on mobility and attrition. The Crusaders relied on shock and brute force. In that narrow valley, shock won. The Turkish bows, so deadly at a range, were useless against a lance point delivered at full gallop. The hunters became the hunted. Panic is a contagion, and it spread through the Turkish army faster than fire. Kilij Arslan, watching his victory turn into a rout, could not believe his eyes. He had 40,000 men. He had the high ground. He had the trap. And yet, he was watching his army dissolve under the hooves of a few hundred iron men. The psychological dominance of the Seljuks, built over decades of victories, was shattered in 10 minutes of brutal close-quarters butchery. The retreat was chaotic. The Turks abandoned their camp, their treasures, and even their families in a desperate bid to escape the heavy swords of the Franks. The Crusaders, exhausted but pumped full of adrenaline, pursued them for miles. The loot they captured was immense gold, camels, tents, but the real prize was survival. When the dust settled, the valley of Dorylaeum was silent again, save for the groans of the wounded and the carrion birds circling overhead. The Crusaders knelt in the blood-soaked grass, offering prayers of thanks. They had faced a force vastly superior in number and tactics, and they had not only survived, they had dominated. The aftermath of Dorylaeum changed everything. The invincible aura of the Turks was gone. For the rest of the march to Jerusalem, the local garrisons would often flee rather than face the heavy cavalry charge of the Franks. The Crusaders had learned that their heavy armor and shock tactics, though exhausting in the heat, were their greatest asset. They had also learned the value of unity. But there is a deeper, more philosophical lesson hidden in the carnage of that afternoon. Dorylaeum wasn't won by tactics alone. It was won by the refusal to accept the reality of defeat. Bohemond refused to break when surrounded. The women refused to hide when the arrows fell. And the reinforcements refused to stop when the terrain turned against them. History is often written as a series of inevitable events, driven by economics and geography. But sometimes, history hinges on the sheer, stubborn will of a few hundred people who decide that they simply will not die today. It reminds us that when the odds are impossible and the enemy is overwhelming, the only way out is not to retreat, but to charge. This was the day the East learned to fear the charge of the Iron Men. This was the day 500 knights crushed the confidence of an empire. And it was only the beginning. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history where the impossible became reality and the few stood against the many, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are peeling back the layers of the past one battle at a time.